By our work, we are changed. Hello and welcome to episode 11 of the Actual Magicians. Yes, I am an Actual Magicians bookshelf, where today we are going to be covering Chaos Magick, which arrived in England in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, burgeoned in the 80s, and is still going strong. And we can see here Psychonaut and Lieber Null, both by Pete Carroll. We're going to be talking about these books and also the work of Austin Spare. This is a very old, battered copy, and we're going to be looking at my history within Chaos Magick, my little role in Chaos Magick as it developed, particularly through the magazine scene. So what is Chaos Magick? Well, Chaos Magick is... And again, you're only going to get my point of view on this. It is an experimental form of magic that distilled a lot of techniques, particularly sigils, belief change, which we're going to take a look at a practical method of that I've developed in a little while, and also different translations of esoteric concepts into modern parlance and modern practice. For example, egregores and servitors and chaos spheres and things along these lines. So we're going to be taking a look at all of those sorts of ideas, and I'll give you my particular take on each of them. So I'd like to start at the beginning with my own personal history within Chaos Magick itself. I guess I was introduced to Chaos Magick through the publication of Psychonaut, the Manual of the Theory and Practice of Magic. So you can see it's already riffing on Crowley's Theory and Practice of Magic. And this was £6.95 from the Sorcerer's Apprentice in Leeds, where a lot of this was being practiced. And you can see here, published by the Sorcerer's Apprentice. And I used to love these illustrations by Brian Ward in the early books. Chris Bray of the Sorcerer's Apprentice gave the foreword for this, and it was full of ideas like magical combat, sigils, Baphomet, who is illustrated in a good Chaos Magick style, the Demon Coronazon from the Enochian work and from Aleister Crowley, magical weapons, and more importantly, I guess, for our purposes, this idea of magical paradigms or belief systems, I think it's correctly spelt there, the Chaos-etheric paradigm, perhaps it's deliberately spelt with an E, probability manipulation, morphic field theory, holographic universe, higher dimensionality, observer-created universe, and these sort of ideas of applying mathematics, science, and other ideas into attaining a gnosis or personal magical experience through magical practices. So Chaos Magick and the Illuminates of Thanateros, the group that grew out of this, were really ditching the idea of initiation, ditching the idea of hierarchies and grades and magical secrets, and going for a straight, as we say, to the wall idea of what magical practice could be. So as a young 17-year-old, when I first discovered Chaos Magick, I was very excited about it. And immediately when it came out, bought the deluxe version of Lieber Null, which is a bit battered now. Like all Sorcerer's Apprentice books, it has fallen to pieces over the ages because I've used it so much, referred to it so much. So we have ideas of... But you'll notice by now, even quite early on in the system, we've got being the third degree initiate syllabus. So there was already a syllabus of Chaos Magick practice being developed even in the early days of the system, so-called system, I guess. And I was so enamored by it that I practiced and I recorded my work with the entire syllabus of Lieber Null and then sent it to the Illuminates of Thanateros, which at the time was mainly Pete Carroll and Ray Sherwin and other notable names in the occult scene at the time. Ray Sherwin also was known as Paula Pagini and produced other books under that name. So we have this whole idea of the scene of Chaos Magick often called the scene, being developed at the time. And I'm just trying to find some of the illustrations in here. I think they're in this one, or perhaps they're in the other one. Just go here. Yeah, so there were illustrations of strange masked figures and so forth, practicing out in the woods. And quite often this was in an urban setting, mainly around Leeds, places like East Morton and so forth. So it appealed to a more, I guess, urban-based form of magician, I guess, if we could say such a thing. And indeed, people at the time, such as Phil Hine, developed urban shamanism. So it was a mashing of all of these ideas into the culture of the time, into the early to mid to late 80s. Now, this eventually produced a magazine called Chaos International. This is issue 1. And here is where my little part of the story comes in that in issue 1, you'll find a lot of interesting articles. If you want to pause the screen, I'll show you some of the things that were being discussed at the time. So Yog Sothoth, again, an influence from people like H.P. Lovecraft, from Robert Anton Wilson, all sorts of people being brought into, or their work being brought into Chaos Magick. It was a very eclectic system. But already you can see an article by Pete Carroll, Where Do We Go From Here? It became viral, I guess, in the way that things before the internet, or just in the early time of the internet, became viral amongst the occult scene. Everyone was talking about Chaos Magick at that time. So here we have an article called Computers in Chaosium by Freighter WHH. And Freighter WHH is myself. I took the name for Chaos Magick at least as a homage to William Hope Hodgson, who'd written 2 very influential novels for me, one called The House on the Borderland and the other called The Nightland, both of which are extremely H.P. Lovecraft style, gothic, horror, transdimensional, mind-melting, early seminal texts, particularly The House on the Borderlands. And I was obsessed with the symbol of the House on the Borderlands, so I took the name WHH. And here you can see an article called Magical Aeons, where we can see a systemization, I guess, of occult systems in the mid-80s. And you can see here the Mark Current that I was also involved with, and the Grant Typhonian OTO, which I was also involved with. If nothing, I was quite eclectic when I was sort of 17 into my early 20s, and so I was involved in a lot of these scenes. In fact, I think there may even be one of my poems in this as well. I can't remember. There were very few article writers at the time, so we all used quite a lot of different pseudonyms for, and we'll come back to the KO Chamber and Chaos Spheres in a bit. But here's Computers in the Chaosium, one of the very first uses of technology, I guess, for occultism, computer technology at least. And it's a basic program for doing Gematria. In fact, there are 3 programs there for doing Gematria, followed by the Gnostic Banishing Ritual by Pete Carroll. So that was a sample run of coming up with English and Hebrew Gematria, and I think it dates it, but I began my interest with a 1K Sinclair. So I tried to write my programs with a common standard of about 48K. That's K, not M or G, 48K or lower. Most computers of this capability fall into the £100 area, so I'll assume this as a maximum. Because at the time, I didn't know how many other people would even have access to a computer. I did this on £5,000 worth of IBM 10 meg computer, a 10 meg computer for 5,000. That was at the British Rail Research and Development Centre in Derby, so don't anyone tell them. but I was developing Gematria programs on the IBM at the time. And by Chaos International number 2, we were looking at things like Satanism and Chaos Magick, paganism and Chaos Magick, the OTO and Chaos Magick, how to work in a group with Chaos Magick, and all sorts of other things. So Chaos Magick really took its place in the history of magic. And here we have a second article by myself, and this one was to do the I Ching and tarot. So there's a tarot reading program, and here's a I Ching program, and that's actually dated, and that's 5th of March 1986. So I would have been about 21 at that time, I think, by the time this one had come out. You can see the psychedelic imagery being used here. The mystery of Shekinah. Again, it was such a seminal time for occultism, and we were all developing a very experimental, eclectic form of occultism. That's my little poem there called The Clockwork Museum, which was my version of Yesod. I got given a key, but I thought it a tree. I got given a map, but I thought it was a trap. I got given away, but that was yesterday. I got given a spell, but no one to tell. It's full of late teen, early adult angst, I guess, some of my poetry of the time. And Chaos International number 3, again, this has interesting letters in it because, again, most of the occultism at the time was being done through correspondence, through letters in the magazines of the time. For example, Pagan News and Chaos International, and a lot of us were developing our own magazines at the time as well, because it was the only way we could keep in touch with each other, and desktop publishing was becoming just about accessible to a few people, usually who worked in IT in some form or another. I'm just trying to find, so here we have Chaosium and the Thelema, the Pact's position on the OTO. So you can see already in the early days of Chaos Magick, it was bumping up against some of the established groups of the time, which were mainly either Golden Dawn derived or OTO derived. And then there was the Mart current, which didn't really take off that much, but is still something very close to my own heart. And forms of chaos shamanism, sort of Castaneda-inspired working going on as well. So I think this is actually issue 5, and this was being edited now by Phil Hine, and I think perhaps Pete Carroll had sort of left the main scene as early as then, or it may have been a little bit later. So that's basically the personal history of Chaos Magick, and a lot of other books have been published since. I'm just going to try and grab some of those for you. So we have books such as The Apogeton by Alon Tickhill, which takes a Chaos Magick view of paganism. So we have sections on magical knives, on scientific theorems applied to paganism and so forth. So it was already being applied to a lot of the other outstanding beliefs of the time, and we're going to come on to belief change in a moment. So Liber Chaos, the Psychonomicon, is a sort of blend of Pete Carroll's earlier work, Grimoire of Chaos Magick by Julian Wilde. Again, all very self-published, very experimental sorts of work. And more later things, Paradigmical Pirate by Joshua Wetzel. I'm not that familiar with that one. But Chaos Magick really evolved from books such as Future Shock by Alvin Toffler, Catastrophe Theory, the Gaia Principle in the book by James Lovelock, Chaos, which is really where Pete Carroll had come from. I briefly got to stay with Pete in the very early days, having submitted my completed syllabus for Liber Null. They really didn't know what to do with someone who had actually completed the syllabus, because they didn't really think anyone would follow the syllabus and do the work for it, never mind submit it. So they were really looking at the time to organise sort of cells of the IoT and develop Chaos Magick in a very experimental networked fashion. But we actually found that a little bit too constraining, so when we were working with the Mark current, we actually developed that as a networked order. So everyone was a nexus within a network of non-hierarchical people, all practicing the same thing, meeting and discussing things. So I applied, I guess, the chaos approach to the Mart current, which is interesting, I guess, because Mart is symbolic of order and of the law and of divine law and so forth. But I never saw that as being somehow opposite. I just saw the two currents, the Mark current and the chaos current, as being on different sides of the same coin. And I never really saw the Mark current as a development of Thelema, although it is a development of Thelema. I saw it as something in its own right, opposite to Chaos Magick. I guess that's the way I pictured it in my own head. But these books really gave Pete Carroll the idea and to, I guess, give a model or a set of models for Chaos Magick itself. They broke away but developed Western Esotericism. And so a lot of those models are mathematical, and I just want to touch on one before we come on to belief change. And that one is at the back of Psychonaut, which blew my mind at the time, Catastrophe Theory and Magick. So Catastrophe Theory, the book by Woodcock and Davis, there's the book. And this is basically a development of chaos theory in the sense of the idea of fluid dynamics theory, which is a mouthful, and that's why Pete Carroll decided to call it Chaos Magick, not fluid dynamics theory-based occultism. But that's really what he was going for, the idea that occultism could be explained and rationalized, in a sense, modeled, more importantly, modeled by fluid dynamic theory, by the butterfly principle, which is a more common way of putting it, that one thing can affect another at distance in a way because everything is related to each other, and there could be predictive and mathematical models for that. In the same way, there are early formula of how occultism works. If you have I for imagination or I for intent, how does that relate to the probability of a magical event occurring and so forth? And there have been attempts to model this mathematically, none, in my view, at least successfully. But catastrophe theory is a useful model for initiation because it talks about change. And here we have the occultist and the materialist at odds with each other, and magical experience and tough-mindedness or intent down here. And this shows a graphical way of showing how magical experiences can bend your worldview from being a materialist to an occultist, or keep you away from that, unless something suddenly happens in your life that changes your entire worldview completely. A magical event intercedes in your life, and all of a sudden there's an accession, and you flip from here to here because you actually go through that flip in one go, and these things are quite close, even though they seem quite apart. And that's one of the good ways of explaining initiation, that you go from one sort of belief and flip round to another really quickly, even though it's a progressive and slow growth to that point. There is a flip point, a turning point. And so magical initiation is mentioned briefly at the back of this, and that's where I got my inspiration for using this as a model. And so there's some really useful models in occult practice to show how we practice occultism, how magic actually works within Chaos Magick itself. But there were a lot of other factors that were brought into Chaos Magick, such as the Dice Man work, which we've looked at before, and I'll put a link to the video somewhere up here or up there somewhere. And I think a lot of these systems really are worth going back to. That was always one of my things, that when I was reading Crowley, I'd go back to Kabbalah, I'd go back to the Enochian work. I'd always try and trace the sources of what the synthesists were actually pulling together. Because while there's a virtue in synthesis, there's also a virtue in the original strands, which you can find. You can take different directions yourself. This is something I'd encourage you to do within Chaos Magick, is experiment, go back to the sources and look at them for yourself and see where you develop them to. Again, very different approach to a lot of Western Esotericism at the time, which was bound by Freemasonic paradigms, I guess, in the sense of initiation, grades, a sense of ranking and having to pass certain rituals and pass certain knowledge in order to make progression within a system. Chaos Magick broke away from all of that and said, every man and woman for themselves, your worldview is your own, and develop that. Now, there have been certain concepts that have become the bedrock, I guess, of Chaos Magick when you search for it online, and those are sigils, which we'll come and take a look at, egregores and servitors. And this is because these ideas of having egregores and servitors, these transdimensional beings, these spiritual beings perhaps, these astral entities, is very alluring. It's very tempting, particularly to someone who's new to occultism. The idea of spirits about, and some of them might be dangerous, or some of them you can bend to your will. A lot of occultism, if the demons will let me say it correctly, is predicated on this control idea, and I think that's one of the worst temptations in occultism as far as I'm concerned. It's good to begin with, to practice with these things and to be concerned about them, to have an awareness of them, but it keeps you in a state of separation. It keeps you in an artificial state of being in one place while these beings are in another place, and that there's therefore some level of control between these two things. But the whole idea of duality is the myth, is the problem with the paradigm, and therefore that's the one that needs transcending ideally and ultimately, rather than working with spirits. So yes, it's interesting, and we can't help but be fascinated by the idea of egregores and servitors. But this is not the end of, this is the start of the journey and not the end of it. So an egregore, there's a recent book, relatively recently, called Egregores by Mark Stavish. It's a bit of a strange book. I'm not sure if I quite understand where he's going with the idea, but he subtitles it, The Occult Entities That Watch Over Human Destiny. There's an idea that egregores are basically spirits or spiritual beings, or a angelic force in a sense, that watches over humanity, watches over different cultures and different people or groups have their own egregore. And in the early days of Chaos Magick, there were often experiments and attempts to contact one's egregore or the group egregore, or even create it, usually by using sigils, in order to have that sort of power and that connection with the egregore. In a sense, it's a chaos reworking of the idea of contacted magical orders, a la Dion Fortune and the like, where earlier on in occultism, relatively earlier on compared to Chaos Magick, there was often a form of social capital in having a contacted group, a group that was in touch astrally, etherically, to an ancient master, an ancient teacher, an ancient deity or something. And I think Chaos Magick, like so many things, took that idea because it is real, it's something that happens, and remodeled it and gave it new language, in the same way that they ditched initiation and grades, but then realized that some people had to do some things, otherwise the whole system fell apart, so had to reinvent a relabeled form of hierarchy or structure. And this is the downfall of a lot of groups, where they try and kick something out without understanding it because they're rebelling against it, but then just have to replace it at some point with a faulty mechanism because they're still trying not to take on the baggage that comes with the previous mechanism, for example, hierarchies and initiation. So the idea of egregores to me is better summed up in Kurt Vonnegut's Cat's Cradle, which is one of my mainstay books that I have on my invisible shelf just here, of all of the books that I would throw out the window in case of a fire. So the first books in Cat's Cradle is one of them. And this basically has a lot of teachings in it from a so-called prophet that's in the book, and they're all given in the form of calypso rhymes. So I won't try and sing any of them for you, but one of my favourites in here, one of my favourite concepts, is cuirasses and granfalloons. And a cuirass is basically usually a couple of people or a small group of people that have been brought together to do something that there's no rational linear cause for. So a cuirass is formed with very particular people. It's sort of like a soulmate that isn't a soulmate. So a cuirass is formed for a little while between a certain group of people to do something very important in the universe, whereas a granfalloon is all of the artificial constructs like companies, large organizations, governments and so forth that are humanity constructed that are false. And when Bokanon, the prophet in the book, is explaining this concept, he says, if you want to know what's inside a granfalloon, then peel the skin of an old balloon. Because basically a granfalloon is all surface and there's nothing inside it. And to me, that's like an egregore. An egregore is a granfalloon. It's a concept that holds a group together, a society together, but actually there's nothing inside it like a granfalloon. I far more prefer to find cuirasses where all of a sudden you're brought into touch with people and you know after a while you can recognize a cuirass forming because of its particular and odd nature, and you don't know why you're in touch with that person or have met that person or these people have come together, but you do know, you recognize that something important is going to come out of that cuirass, out of the work of that cuirass. And that's explained a lot more in Cat's Cradle. And I like that idea better than egregores, to be honest. So before I just go on to servitors, I just wanted to mention a few of the later books. New Falcon Publications became a good source of Chaos Magick books at a time because they'd already published Robert Anton Wilson in particular, whose work with Discordianism and the goddess Eris really, I guess Chaos Magick in its early days was a UK English version of Discordianism. So Condensed Chaos by Phil Hine, and again you'll see there's a foreword by Pete Carroll there. Cyber Magick by Pete Carroll, another New Falcon publication. But some of the earlier books are really interesting. This is a really important book for my work, Undoing Yourself with Energized Meditation. Again, prefaced by Robert Anton Wilson, introduced by Israel Regardie and by Christopher Hyatt. And All Rights Reversed by Antero Ali. Those two books were really, I guess, mind-bending for me as a young magician, really contrasted to the Golden Dawn work that I was doing at the time and the witchcraft work and pagan work and so forth. These two books really flung me out of that and gave me a different perspective on the things I were doing. They changed it, but they didn't get in the way of it. They provided new ways of looking at those things. And then later works by Pete Carroll and the Octavo and Cyber Magick and so forth. And then a slightly earlier one that I'd recommend, Jan Fries, who came and stayed with us on a Mart Temple meeting once upon a time back in the Mart days, a manual of freestyle shamanism. Jan's work and his artwork really captures the vibe of that time and the work that we were doing with visualization, with shamanism, with this is a sort of chaos form of shamanism, I guess, and this is a highly recommended book, Freestyle Shamanism. So when we look at one of the other mainstays of Chaos Magick, Sigils, we're really going back to Austin Spare, and I've done several shorts on some of the best Austin Spare books to get, which I shall try and link somewhere up here. And my introduction to Austin Spare was through this Sorcerer's Apprentice publication and the references in Liber Null, and this one is 422 out of 481 that were published. And you can see it's very, very much fallen to pieces. It's now totally loose leaf. But Sigils comes straight from Austin Spare's work, and here we see the death posture, which is a meditative practice of forced breathing and posture, a yogic practice that induces a trance state so that you can visualize a sigil and empower it. And you'll notice that the sigil at the top there is actually the sigil, the eightfold chaos sigil that became the mainstay of Chaos Magick. And here we've got vision by the sense of touch, the process of stealing the fire from heaven, the death posture, second position. And I used to copy these symbols by heart and then write whole padfuls of my own weird writing with those sorts of sigils. So you can see a lot of Austin's work was about identity and forms of identity. And again, we're going to take a look at a belief change method in a little bit just to conclude this video, give you an introduction to some of the things you can do with Chaos Magick itself. But sigils are basically a way of formulating complex thoughts into simple symbols and then empowering that symbol through magical practice, shamanic practice, artistic practice, in order to activate it and make changes. And I think those changes are more about yourself than about reality as well. Again, this was published in 1982 by the Sorcerer's Apprentice. And it has this whole story that fascinated me as a late teen, I guess, Zod Kia's dominion, the relationship of the Kia and Zod, which are parts of the self. We can see some of Austin Spare's artwork, and again, there are other books now on Austin Spare that have come out since, showcasing his artwork a lot better than this very first. I used to have a photocopy of that in my study. I thought that was such a cool image. The artist as a young artist. So a lot of the sigil work comes from this, and I may do a advanced magician's explainer on the sigils at some future point, but in essence, a simple practice with sigils is to take a concept, take something you want to change, write it down in a sentence, take just the consonants or the vowels out of it, write that down as a sentence, and reduce it until you have a few letters. And then you can, let me just do this on the cuff. So if I say, for example, wanted to develop a little bit more, let's go for something easy that we've done before, a finance thing, and I wanted to improve my finance, I might say improve finance. So I would just write that down. And then I might take the first and 2 letters and then the last 2 letters. So I've gone for the first 2 letters in the middle and the last 2 letters, so that encapsulates that phrase. And then I might, the way I do it is I tend to maybe reverse a couple, like so. So you can see I put the I, the F and the 2 E's like this. And then I'll do a more slightly sigilized version of that. So that would look something like the symbol that we have at the bottom there. I would then take that sigil and activate it, and I'll probably do this tonight. I'll just stick that under my pillow and I'll visualize it as I go to sleep, and then we will let go of the release of the energy for that and forget about it entirely, and that's all we'll do. And that's just a simple way of doing a sigil. And as Shakespeare said, hush, the spell's wound up. And as we've looked in how to make a magical spell work, that we also did with the finance spell that I demonstrated working, is you have to just let go of it as soon as you've done it. And this is the important thing with all magic. So a lot of chaos magic, as we've seen, is of an experimental nature. It is really a breath of fresh air when it came to the previous hidebound traditional hierarchical groups of the time. But one of the experimental things about it is adopting different beliefs, and we've already seen in my video on the Dice Man where that methodology and where that approach comes from. It certainly inspired Pete Carroll, that's for sure. And so I'd like to give you just one little way of radically altering your belief and identity, which is fairly safe to practice, but again, experiment with it. As a doctor recently said to me, make sure it's within your normal range of movement. It's referring to a physical movement, but it also goes for magical movement as well. Make sure it's within your normal or acceptable range of movement, this particular method. So let's get ready and I'll teach you this very brief method of belief change. Okay, so this method is a belief change, and I stole it from a version of a method by Richard Bandler that he taught in a seminar once, one of the co-founders of NLP that I think I've got another video about. But here we go. This is a simple way of belief change work that suits the Chaos Magic approach. I want you to take a belief that you're reasonably sure about, and in this case I want it to be about you, about yourself, okay? So, and make it a slightly negative or neutral one, not a positive one. We want to work with a slightly negative one, but not one that's deeply entrenched, that you don't believe could be just snapped away like that. So, for example, it might be, let's go for lack of confidence, which is something my NLP clients come to me on occasion with, a lack of confidence. And what you can do, and I'll ask you to do this with me once you have got this for yourself, is whatever the feeling is, I want you to feel where you feel it the most. Feel where you feel it the most. It could be in your head. It could be a weird buzzing feeling around you. It could be a sharp intake of breath that you feel here. It could be a sickly feeling deep in your stomach. It could be a shaking of the hands. It could be a tightening of the shoulders. Wherever you feel that feeling the most, when you feel about it, when you feel what you feel, when you feel that feeling, when you imagine hearing what you hear inside your head or outside, when you can see what you might see, what comes to mind when you think about that negative feeling, whereabouts in your body do you feel that the most? You must feel it somewhere, of course, because otherwise you can't have a feeling that's entirely displaced. And if it is, then you can say you feel it all around you, that it's displaced. Again, with my particular approach, at least we go for incorporation and utilization. There's no wrong answer. There's only communication. This is one of the tenets of NLP. So I want you to locate that feeling, and I'm going to say my lack of confidence is somewhere here. And then what I want you to do is do these things. And this I borrowed into NLP via Chaos Magick, via Clean Language. So I cite my sources with each of those things: NLP, Clean Language, and a bit of Chaos Magick. So I want you to ask these questions of yourself. First of all, what size is it? What size is it? Is it like a tight ball? Is it about this big? Is it like here? Is it a pinpoint? Is it like a round? What size is that feeling? If it's a feeling that you're feeling, it must have a size. So we can ask that question safely. For the counsellors or therapists who might be thinking about using Clean Language in NLP, that's a side thing, that you do the questions in this order because of this, because each one implies in an Ericksonian way an unconscious representation of the next question that you're going to ask. So what size is it is the first thing. Now, I already gave away the next question in how I was explaining my feeling, which was I asked what size that sphere might be, or that ball might be. So the size of it is the first thing, and then what shape is it? Is it a square? Is it a point? Is it a load of butterflies in your stomach, and so forth? So where is it? Where do you feel it the most? Because you must feel it, it's implied. What size is it? And then what shape is it? And you can also ask then, now it's got a location, a shape, a location, a size, and a shape. What colour is it? So I'll make mine black. Mine feels black, for example. It actually feels, I guess, thinking about it more, sort of sickly green, an off-colour green. So I'll go with that, an off-colour green. You'll notice that when you do this yourself, or when you ask someone else to do it, they'll motion with their hands and they'll say, I don't know, I can't feel that. I don't know where I feel it. And they'll actually, their body will tell you, their unconscious will clearly communicate where they're feeling that. No, I don't know. And they'll show you exactly before you then have to wait 5 minutes to get their conscious mind to catch up with their unconscious communication of it. So what have we got? We've got location, we've got shape, we've got location, size, shape, colour, and we can also ask about movement. Is it still? Mine feels like it's lurking there, sort of right in the background. It's just not moving at all. And again, incorporation and utilization. If someone says there's no movement, we incorporate and utilize that as a valid answer. We don't say, but it must have movement for my technique to work. Stillness can count. Okay, so yours might be moving around, it might be expanding, it might be like clawing at you. They're all sorts of different, whatever works for you. And again, a tenet of Chaos Magick is it's your experiment, you are the workshop. So it's really important you take what works for you. And then once you've got that, so mine is this off-colour green ball sitting in the back of here, this location here. Interestingly enough, again, as a bit of a sideline, you can move someone's finger if they point to it and say, is it there? And they'll go, no, it's there. And you go, what about down here? Or you move it up here, and they'll go, no. And they'll shudder, and they'll actually move it back. Like if they point here and you move the finger here, they'll actually just move it back. And it's precise. And that's the weird thing. It's really precise. So once you've done that, and again, now we come on to a bit of Chaos Magick, I want you to take 3 really deep breaths. And when you breathe out the third breath, as you breathe it out, I want you to project this feeling out, like you're breathing it out, it's coming out in front of you. And I want you to see a sigil on it, a shape. And it could be a complex one, a simple one. It could be a letter, like the letter A. It could be a bow, like a U shape that's reversed, or a curve or a squiggle or anything. I want you just to imagine that is in front of you, okay? So take 3 deep breaths. And as you breathe out the third, I'm going to get this ball out, and I'm going to see it there, and I'm going to put the sigil on it, which is, for me, it's like 2 knife blades, sort of like crossing each other. Right. And now I'm going to leave it there. And then what I want you to do once you've done that is just pause for a moment. And then I want you to grab it and squeeze it down into your hand so that you can hold the sigil. And whilst you do that, I want you to notice that the belief is no longer inside you. And if it does feel as if it's there, then repeat the process until you can hold it in your hand. And then I just want you to go out for a bit or walk around the house or the room even, just for a few moments, experiencing what it is like to not have that belief inside you. That it just isn't there. It's in your hand, encapsulated in the sigil. And then when you're ready, you can just release that. And if the belief comes back, it's fine. If it stays away, then that's also fine. Whatever works for you is absolutely fine. It's just a moment to experience having that belief outside of you, that small belief, that slightly negative belief, and to hold that outside of you just for a while, encapsulated in a sigil. And of course, if you're way ahead of me, then you'll realize that once we have it as a sigil, we can do a lot of other things with it as well. We can actually utilize that energy, that negative energy or previously negative energy, in a far more creative and positive way in our relationship to the universe. But this is just one of the many belief changes that you can do or exercises. And you'll notice we've not done that as a ritual. But you can perhaps recognize from maybe some of the things we've already talked about in previous videos about ritual, that there are components of a ritual in there. There are components, purification, consecration, making the sigil, banishing, and so forth, that this is chaos magic in its real sense, to me at least, that we are utilizing and incorporating everything to serve a particular purpose, and that's really what we're doing. And if you wonder why I've not mentioned servitors at all, guess what we've just done? We have located and banished a negative servitor. And that was just, I wanted to give a practical way of doing something rather than explain all of the different concepts and confusions that people have about such things. In at least a chaos magic point of view, that was a summoning, a banishing, and perhaps even a powering of a sigil, if you then want to use that sigil in some way, of a servitor. Okay, so I hope that's been of some interest to you, and I hope I've covered the general history and approach of chaos magic, and I look forward to seeing you in a further video in the Actual Magician Explains series. So thank you for joining me, and as ever, the worker is hidden in the workshop. Thank you.